Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's CJCM Youth Assembly, or Youth Day Assembly, rather. And today we're doing a number of things as we continue with the number of these assemblies, but today's in particular focuses on not just youth, but youth struggles and youth perspectives with regards to fighting climate justice fights. So our program today will address this in three folds as we take in a CJCM youth perspective, focusing on not just universities, but broader coalitions of students and youth activities around climate justice struggles. And the way in which we will be addressing that today is by beginning with the first session, which will be chaired by Charles Semane on youth concerns, which will be followed by a CJCM response and discussion around CJCM tools and policies. And then finally, we will have our book launch for the People's and Workers' Climate Justice Charter Futures for South Africa. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Charles Semane to chair the first session on youth concerns.
Thank you very much, Awande. I'd just like to double check if those online can hear us correctly.
We can hear you well, Charles.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for joining us this morning for this CJCM Youth Day Assembly. So in the first panel, to reflect on youth concerns, we have Reina from Wits. If you can give her a hand. You know, June 16 is engraved in the memory of our country as a day of resistance. But also it is a reminder of the brutality of the apartheid regime and what we had to encounter and what we had to go through to get to this moment. So whenever we gather together for the June 16 event all around the country, it's about remembering that the freedom we have now was a freedom that was fought for. It's a freedom that was paid for with blood, and it's a freedom that we have to do everything to protect. We have to protect it from those who seek dictatorial tendencies. We have to protect it from the cronies who only want to enrich themselves. We have to protect it from the tenderpreneurs who only want to enrich themselves and do not care about the people. And also we have to protect it from this idea that as civil society we are defeated, because civil society is not defeated, but civil society is putting forth the solutions to the crises that we have. So I would like to call Reina to come and give her reflections and concerns on June 16 under the theme, the next youth struggle is the climate justice struggle. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Firstly, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to speak and share what we have as the youth from WITS got to say. This is a really great platform, and on behalf of WITS CJCM, we really appreciate that we can speak here. I'm going to start by speaking about some of the challenges that we've encountered or that we've seen so far. And these are challenges that have come up even though we have really just started as CJCM WITS. It's only been a couple of months since we've started to organize and try and mobilize as many people as possible into the movement. And one of the first challenges that we've been facing as the youth, I think, is looking at the project ahead of us, which is institutional change. Because a lot of the times when you're organizing events or doing any kind of community-based work, those things are beneficial and they're important and they're successful and they're impactful. But the hardest part about it is that when you look ahead at the project in front of you, you have to deconstruct the kind of system that has got us here in the first place. And so it's really difficult then to think about how to deconstruct institutions, whether it's institutions of higher education, whether it's institutions that belong to the state, whether it's the capitalist institution itself. I think as the youth, looking at that project is something that feels so much bigger than ourselves, and so it can often be the biggest challenge. But having said that, I think one of the most empowering ways then to deal with that issue is to remember the power that we have, but also to continue in the small changes that we can make, because I think progress is progress, regardless of the size, regardless of its level of how tangible it is. But one of the second challenges that we faced so far is getting solid, loyal membership. And this has been really challenging because a lot of the times when it comes to social movements, and particularly with the climate movement, there's a difference between people being interested and people caring about it versus people actually wanting to be a part of the fight for change. And there's that small discrepancy, which often means that people will listen to you, but they won't perhaps come and help aid in the fight. And so the other challenge then is to bridge that gap between awareness of the climate crisis and willingness to actually fight it, and willingness to commit to fighting it over a long period of time. And having said that, I think one of the challenges that is very underlying in that issue is the idea that the climate crisis is a crisis in and of itself, that it stands alone. But I think particularly in the socio-political reality of living in South Africa, that's not actually the case. The climate crisis is something that's incredibly and inherently intersectional. And I think because of the discourse that we often use and the discourse that we often hear about the climate crisis being something that is so separate from everything else, when you try and tell people about the importance of fighting for the climate, they tell you that there's other more important things to fight for, or they will tell you that I'm fighting for gender equality, or I'm fighting for equal pay, or I'm fighting for my human rights. And often we've compartmentalized the struggles that we face. And so when you do tell people about the climate crisis, the first thing that they say is to back away because it's not the most important. But I think we need to stray away from that discourse, and we need to realize that the climate crisis is all of those struggles put together, that it is inherently everything else, that the climate crisis is a decolonial crisis as well. It is fighting for gender equality. It is fighting for basic human rights. And so I think that is also one of the challenges we face in terms of getting people to be a part of this movement more than just an interest towards it. And then lastly, I think this problem is something that I guess all the youth around the world will face, but it's essentially the fact that not many people take the youth seriously, and not many people listen to the youth. And that's something that's particularly important, especially when it comes to getting institutional change, because a lot of the institutions are governed by people who aren't willing to give some time to the youth, who aren't willing to listen to the youth. And so I think that that is another one of those challenges that we face. But really, the only way to combat that, I believe, is just like a very radical taking up of that space, a radical denial of all of this rhetoric about denying the youth any kind of involvement or any kind of decision-making abilities in their own futures. So those are just some of the challenges that we've observed so far. But moving on to a little bit more of a positive outlook then, what are the actual opportunities to create the changes that we want? And there's two things. The first is education. And I think this is always, in any kind of struggle, in any kind of social movement, it's always proved to be the strongest tool of empowerment and mobilization. And with the climate crisis, when we think about educating people or sharing the knowledge in the space that we have here with people outside, it's not just about explaining the climate crisis, but I think we need to focus specifically on explaining why the climate crisis is all the other crises that we're facing. It's a deconstruction of capitalism. It's a deconstruction of the patriarchal system. And And so I think adding that to our systems of education, adding that to the way that we reach out to people will make the difference. And it will make them realize that most people are actually fighting for the core beliefs of what CJCM and what the climate emancipation calls for. I think they perhaps just don't know it because, like I said earlier, we've compartmentalized our struggles. And so I think education is one of the strongest tools. And I think coming from our perspective, there's a great deal of potential that's held within higher education spaces like universities. I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first is that students are always present, they're always willing to learn. It's an environment where they are naturally exposed to so much more outside of themselves. But secondly, the university space is a space that we can particularly use to tap into more than one kind of group. And I think for us, one of our goals then is to have more workshops and to have more information sessions that are not just targeted to students, but targeted to all staff members at WITS, because that is the only way that you can kind of grow the knowledge base and the interest and sustain that. And then the second thing I think is just staying and continuing with grassroots, tangible, community-led initiatives, because I think that there's particularly something impactful when you can see tangibly the difference that your initiatives make. And I just want to chat quickly about the food gardens under this section, because the food gardens at WITS have just recently been restarted, and we've got a timetable and a schedule of people volunteering. And that's an example of where it really makes a difference, because from just knowing about the climate crisis in your mind to be able to come on a day of the week when you have the time to actually tend to the gardens, it gives you a tangible reality in a very real example that it's not just a very up in the air idea of what's at stake with the climate crisis. It's actually food. It's our basic human rights. And so I think doing more of those initiatives, it's something that's going to help grow our community base and move one from just caring about the climate crisis to appreciating the earth, and then from there on being committed and sustained to this breakthrough. So those are just some of the reflections from what we have at WITS CJCM. But like I said, we've just started, and so the road ahead is going to be long, but we're all committed to that practice. And thank you for having us be a part of this very empowering space.
Thank you so much, Reina. Without taking any further time, Cassandra, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. If you haven't met me before, my name is Cassandra Nasi. I am currently an honours student here at WITS, specifically in the International Relations Department. So I don't want to make this too long, as I think Reina has hit on many points that I was going to bring up. But I'd like to kind of share my own personal journey and discovering and exploring the climate crisis. So I'm someone that is interested specifically in post-colonial studies as well as feminist studies. And I've always been focused on social justice. And I've realized with myself when I stepped into Vish's classroom that I came from a very anthropomorphic centric sort of standpoint. I too kind of compartmentalized these type of struggles. I was like, well, I want to fight for women's rights. I want to ensure equality amongst all people and equity, but I didn't understand at the time how impactful the climate crisis was on a general scale, that it was just going to worsen these issues that I'm trying to fix, or these issues that I'm exploring within my own studies. So one other thing that I feel that many students feel within the climate crisis is the fact that it feels so big. And because of that, it feels like something that can't easily be fixed. And when you get kind of the symbolism that is happening across the world, where Greta Thunberg is seen as like the leader of the climate crisis, it kind of marginalizes and erases all the people that are on the ground that might not be from the West, that might be doing community-based initiatives. It makes it very individual. And it's not to say that Greta Thunberg hasn't been a great activist. It's just that most of the criticism is thrown her way, and she's become a martyr, and it kind of erases all the other valid points and the valid movements that people are doing on the ground, as well as kind of voices from the global south. And this is not her fault, but it's just the way that global institutions want to marginalize people like her that are fighting against the climate crisis. And on top of that, it's very difficult when you're seeing at an international level that all of these people that are going to these climate crisis conferences that are making the big decisions are sponsored by the people that are continuing this crisis. Like, I think Coca-Cola sponsored one of those big conferences. And when we have that, there's like this inherent contradiction. So for us, it's like, okay, there's people fighting. We want this to happen, but it's not deconstructing that system. We're playing into it. We're getting people that are selling their carbon emission regulations, or what's the tickets? Sorry. The word isn't coming to me now, but there's a trade instead of an actual reduction. And also I found that at least online and in social spaces, the West kind of dominates the narrative in leading the climate justice movement, in the sense that it's the fault, or it's these global south countries that are continuing this waste and continue manufacturing and we going green, but it fails to acknowledge that a lot of this technology is copyrighted, and a lot of these countries don't want to sell off their property rights for the sake of kind of creating a better future for all, and kind of like this villainization of the global south. So, and continued on to that, I think a lot of people feel that when we are changing our kind of everyday routines, we are making choices, whether it be living zero waste, becoming vegan, only buying from certain places, buying specifically maybe more sustainable clothing, and all those types of processes, it becomes too individualized. And sometimes it becomes a thing of like, I'm a better person because I do this. And it fails to acknowledge that we need community-based sustainability. We need to have sympathy for others, because there are barriers. People can have the choice to buy maybe more sustainable clothing, but that comes with a price. Some people can't go vegan for reasons. Maybe they don't have access to certain things. Also, importing food kind of adds to the global food system problem. So I think those are the things that can make us feel defeatist, deflated, and maybe not understand that there is joy. We can find strength in this. We can find strength in community. We can actually move forward. It isn't your fault, but you can help. And it's not just a you problem, it's a global problem, but we can get through it by getting together. So in terms of unique ideas for this, Rain and I sat down and we were chatting about things that we can do as CJC going forward, because we found that a lot of people are keen, but they're like, what can we do? And because we're getting started, we're still figuring that out, but there is that enthusiasm. And then there's also people that just don't see it, but that's fine. We'll work with the people that are neutral or that are keen. So one of the ideas that I think could be a really, really cool thing is specifically to do with the food gardens and the ideas that CJCM has put forth. But I think when we are harvesting, I had the pleasure of harvesting sweet potatoes from the garden the other day, and it was really cool. I felt like I was going back to my Portuguese farmer roots. But when we have these harvest days, to get together and celebrate it, because we need that sense of community. And if we don't embed our community values and our social values and our celebration in working towards a better future, we can't keep on having this doom and gloom. So we suggested having a mass plant day and then celebrating it afterwards, and having a party, and then maybe even having people like perform, or having that community based afterwards, because if people feel good about what they do, they're going to do it more, and there's more joy. But anyway, Thank you so much. And thank you for giving me this platform. And I hope you have a wonderful youth day.
Thank you so much, Reina and Cassandra. You've touched on very important aspects that we battle with in our strategic perspective documents, and that is moving from symbolic climate justice resistance towards a global climate justice bloc of governments, workers, and movements. But it starts with building the movement here in South Africa. So thank you so much for that. Next, we have Geronimo de Klerk, who's joining us online. Geronimo, over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for the opportunity, Charles. I'm not sure whether you guys can hear me.
Recording in progress.
Hi, comrades, can you hear me? Okay, so okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Com, because I'm currently at the evening. I think hopefully you guys can hear me. But in terms of our youth and the role that our youth is playing in terms of building the climate justice charter movement, I think one of the key things is that the youth represent the most vital and energetic element of the planet, which is of course by serving and making sure to build, the climate justice charter movement. Starting off with our youth in Elsies River, Cape Town. Our youth has started basically with producing food gardens in schools, giving education around food security. And I think that is the most important thing that we as a youth in Elsies River and in Cape Town is busy building. Since the beginning of the building of the climate justice, since the beginning when we joined, up until now, we have created more than 14 food gardens in Elsies River alone, which is a huge impact. And I think that part of this is, of course, where we can see that the changes can only come from the youth in the community. And therefore, we're absolutely grateful because that is how we build, our youth, and that is how we build solidarity within our communities. But secondly, I would also like to raise is that the issue of climate change and food sovereignty is one of the things that is in our community. That's basically something that our community is affected by, and worse, we live in poverty. We live in people living in six on this side. The other day when there was floods, more than 15 of our houses on this side was over flooded of water. And I think those are the kind of things that we need to look at. How is our infrastructure? What role does the youth play in terms of making sure that we can make these changes? And therefore, I'm absolutely grateful for this platform by sharing this, and absolutely grateful to share what the youth has been busy with. I think we started off with the water mapping process. So the water mapping process is where we map our water of how much water we as communities and households are using, and how much water the city of Cape Town is producing for us, or giving us, or what we have access to. And I think one of the things that we discovered is that we do not have enough water. We do not have access to enough water, but meanwhile, our houses were flooded of the water that basically overflood in our houses, in the people's sex. So that is the things that we need to look at, and we as the youth came up with a petition, and we had a meeting yesterday where we say that there's 350 liters of water that they give for the community. It's currently not enough when people is living 5 or 10 people in one place, and that is why we are creating already food gardens. But now we need the second option on what are we going to do in terms of making sure that the people in Cape Town, Elsies River, have sufficient water, and not sufficient water when it comes to floods alone. So therefore, I think that is what I wanted to touch base on. And secondly, what I also wanted to touch base is that what is currently happening in terms of building the climate justice charter movement on this side in Elsies River. I think we had absolutely a great workshops for the following weeks building the climate justice charter movement. But I think I've touched on the most important things on regarding the water issue that we as the Cape Townians on this side in Elsies River are struggling with. Secondly, the food program, the food security programs, and I think more than half of our community is suffering from hunger, and there where the youth plays a huge role by producing food gardens. I think what we also do is that on a daily basis we deliver food, vegetable boxes to elderly, and that is where we can really see that it's busy making the community, and they can everyone is self-making. It's not here to what the youth is doing in their own capacity. So I will just leave it on that. I'm not sure whether I covered everything, comrade. You can just add or ask questions if there's anything else that I need to touch base on.
Thank you so much, Comrade Geronimo. I do apologize for the audio quality on Geronimo's side. They are actually organizing a youth gathering in Cape Town, the CJCM youth gathering there. Geronimo is working with a lot of young people. They have a group of about 80 core young activists, and they've built a wonderful food sovereignty space in Mitchell's Plain. They've been recruiting very hard at building the CJCM in Cape Town. So we congratulate him and the rest of them for their work. It's truly inspiring. And without wasting any further time, I'll hand over to Ferial to take us straight to the next session. To Stacey to chair the next session, which is the CJCM response. Thank you so much, Stacey. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. Good morning, everybody, and a very happy Youth Day to everyone. Thank you so much to the speakers in the first session, some sobering and interesting words. In this second session, we'll be looking at some of the efforts of the CJCM up to this point, and hopefully it will speak to some of the issues that have been raised. I believe that we'll be looking at a couple of the pieces of research that are being done on behalf of the CJCM by different researchers, most of whom work for the organization called COPAC. I just want to find the program quickly. So the first of these will be Ferial, who will be sharing with us the work that she has been doing with regards to water. Ferial is an activist in that space, and so she has the wonderful combination of robust research and direct contact with many water affected communities. So she'll be sharing with us some of her experiences and some of what she has been discovering through the research process. These different pieces of research are all an attempt to take the Climate Justice Charter, which has been developed by the entire movement of organizations, to take the positions of the Charter and concretize them or elaborate them into practical documents that could inform policy. So Ferial will be talking to us about water and a potential water policy that she has been working on. Ferial, over to you.
Thanks, Stacey. Do I have, can I share my screen? Because I have a little bit of a presentation. Let's see. Okay, can you all see my screen?
We can see your screen. At the moment, we're just seeing the actual PowerPoint. But I'm sure
Okay,
good. There we go. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, guys, and greetings, comrades. Yeah, in terms of Youth Day, I think that there have been some good pieces written, and the kind of thing where people are trying to, well, manipulate or build off the back of youth voices to actually further their own aims and objectives, and this covers political parties and corporates and all of that. So like, I think that in that regard, the youth voices and people like CJCM are needed. I also want to just give a, the youth gathering in Pretoria, I think today, with a whole range of other organizations. And I think that I hope that at some point we can all actually support each other and have a joint activity, is my view. So I'm quickly going to just talk about the CJCM Sorry, I'm a bit ill. That's why I'm not there in person. But anyway, about the CJCM, we're developing 14 policy documents, and just to give you a little bit of idea of what we're doing in that regard, and then to go into the policy document that we've been working on in terms of water. So a little bit of context of why water is one of our policy documents. Very briefly talk about the existing regulatory and policy measure, and then the vision that we have for a water policy and some of the challenges and obstacles. I have about 15 minutes, so I'm going to go through some of this quite quickly. Some of the information is not new, so you'll all have it. So I just have to have some water. Okay. So in terms of the CJCM policy development. So I know that Stacey's mentioned some of it already, but I think it's important to mention that, we developed the Climate Justice Charter, and we had this document, and we said, now how do we put this into action? And so the idea was to develop a set of policies. And it's a way of building the pathways from below to achieve the systemic alternatives. And that is important, that we have to understand that the present system is not working in terms of climate justice. So we need to counter the failed policy and government approach that we're seeing. And it's not only South Africa, right? It's global. The alternative policy is one of the ways to advance a deep, just transition. And we have 14 systemic alternatives that are envisaged by the Climate Justice Charter. I think we've launched 3. We'll be launching 2 again, but Charles and Stacey can correct me, and Awande can correct me on that. So these pathways encourages people and communities to develop local solutions. So trying to have democratic say in the management of our water. We know that the present system of our government cannot be trusted to respond with urgency. Sorry about that typo. Okay, so in terms of climate shocks, I think we all kind of, we see this every night. We have a new IPCC report, and we all go around screaming and shouting like, "Oh my God, the world's ending!" And it's true. But we need action, because we keep getting these like alarming bells, and we're not doing enough to actually change it. So we now know that temperatures are about 1.1 degree. We are fast going to reach 1.5, which means that there's no return from that. We're seeing extreme weather events all across the globe: climate shocks, fires, droughts, floods, tropical cyclones, you name it. More than 3 billion people already live in areas that are highly vulnerable. That's 3 billion. That's almost like just a little bit less than half the population of the world. By 2050, 50 to 100 million people in Southern Africa may experience water shortages. And I think we already seeing some of that. And that even the fresh water that we will have increased stress because of the change in rainfall and sea level rise. There'll be increased evaporation in some areas, and that could result in the soils being more salty. It can also lead to the lakes and dams becoming more salty, as we've seen in Kenya with Lake Turkana, where increased evaporation has actually resulted in water that is so salty that you can't use it for irrigation. So these are the kind of problems we're going to see, right? So water inequality and injustice. Access to water is about power and control. We know that. We've seen that it was used that way during the apartheid years, and it is continued to being used that way. The whole thing of having access is used by national government as, like, you'll see this, I'll say globally, 90% of our people have access to clean water, 80% have access to sanitation. And when you break it down, it's such a load of hogwash, really. That whole concept of having access must be challenged. So only about 46% of South Africans have a tap in their homes, and then you can imagine that less than that have running and working taps in those homes. And to add then to that is the failure in local government and government in general to supply people with water, as you are seeing in Johannesburg. So having access is problematic. Approximately 56% of all the wastewater treatment works and 44% of the water treatment works in the country are in a poor or critical condition, which means that in most parts of our country, we don't have clean drinking water. And in most parts of our country, you have a lot of waste, like sewage, that are flowing into our rivers and streams that are polluting the rivers and polluting ecosystems. So it's polluting river ecosystems. At least 60% of river ecosystems are being threatened. And then you add to that climate change. I just want to leave you with a stat that 50,000 liters of sewage is flowing into our rivers and streams per second, comrades. So, and then some 11% of this infrastructure is completely dysfunctional. I have to add that this 11% refers mostly to the pipes and to the treatment works, etc. But I just have to let you know that 90% of our dams have not been checked or monitored for a number of years. So we don't know the safety of our dams that exist. So the policy framework to democratize water. South Africa's water policy is progressive, but implementation is the challenge. So we have some things in the policy that talk about free basic water, access to free basic water, in terms of, and some of the challenges is the centralization is power. So resulted in huge institutional problems within the Department of Water and Sanitation, complete financial mismanagement, and complete corruption. Up until 2021, there was a very high turnover in the Department of Water and Sanitation because of the corrupt ministers who were in there before. There's a lack of regulation and enforcement. So everyone knows that if you read the policies, if you read regulation, if you pollute rivers and streams, you should be arrested and charged. That's not happening. And we know that wastewater treatment works and government is now the biggest polluter of our rivers and streams. How many people do we actually have charged and in jail? So that's the kind of thing where some parts of the policy is good, but the implementation is really poor. So the CJCM needs to be a new and different approach to how water is governed and managed. What we're seeing right now is a complete mess. I mean, if you stand and you look at it, it's like, where do you start? And I think that we have to start from a ground level where we build awareness around these things. And so we need to develop a water policy that takes into consideration the existing situation and the kind of requirements at the regional, national, and local level with regards to climate. I mean, I cannot believe that we have all these plans around water and climate is like one sentence, if we lack it. That future water demands. There's no forward thinking. There's no planning. In like, we know that in South Africa, 90% of our water is already allocated. It is believed that by 2025, there will be no water to allocate, no new water to allocate to anyone. So no new houses, no new developments, all of that. And we know people have no houses. People, small businesses, you want them, they thrive, they growing and building, and you have no water to give them. So how are they still, it's like, I cannot understand how we are still flushing down fresh, clean drinking water in our toilets. It should not be done. So the existing uses increase people's voices and participation in water decisions. That is what a water policy must be about, right? So the measures to democratize the water commons is, firstly, we need to define the commons. We talk about the water commons. If you ask someone in the street, if you ask your sister, if you ask your brother, your grandmother, what is a commons? They'll look at you as if you are losing your mind, right? So how do we define that in a way that people can understand? The second thing is, how do we create education and awareness so that the climate, and I think the speaker before mentioned some really important things, is that we can talk about, like demanding veganism, but what is happening on the ground? So how do we create education and awareness around water and water issues that is not too complex, but it's just basic demands and basic kind of levels of information that people need? And then looking at activist citizen science, which is something we've been using. And if you do want examples where this has actually been working, I have, that's a whole nother paper on its own. But to quickly say that it really has been empowering people to be more active in decisions and to use water testing to make basic demands. Sorry, I just need to wipe my nose. So we've had people testing water, finding that the water is problematic, writing to municipalities, writing to local government, and actually getting communities around them to be organized and work for change. So there are avenues that can do. And then, of course, to challenge policy. We've just allowed policy to just be made by a few, and we just say it comes out and we just follow it, right? So the water pricing, for example, there's a whole new water pricing policy. And if you don't know that in city of Joburg alone, you're going to have the increase of 9% to the price of water. How do they do that? Why are they not doing a stepped tariff where, as you use more, you pay more, so that the corporates like the ArcelorMittals and the Sassels must actually pay a lot more? The cost of climate-related pollution, we don't have that. Free basic water is there, but it's the allowance and the amount that is being offered is a problem. But we also need to look at, if we were saving water, if we had stopped, if we can fight the leaks that we have, that maybe we can do this in a better way. The inequality is increasing. So what you're having is strained water resources, you're having strained services. So you then you're not controlling water use at where people use a lot more, at the high income households. You're not making people more aware that they need to save. In addition, with all that's been going on, all you have is people dropping boreholes. I'm on a community chat where in Melville, they're talking about dropping a borehole per street for people to then come together and use it, right? Which in what's been going on, yeah, but the thing is, you are creating a bigger divide between those that have and those that don't have. So the people in Hammerskraal, for example, still go without water and depend on water tankers that are polluted. But then, people in upper middle class areas can drop boreholes and use as much as they like, because there's no regulation to control how much water people can use from boreholes. So it's also the allocation of water. Large corporate consumers like Eskom, white commercial farmers, timber plantations, mining, all get really big chunks, of course, golf courses, big chunks of water allocation. And that needs a relook. And there's a new policy that came out, and it would be nice to have that discussion. I don't know if we're looking at that in terms of food, but there's a new water licensing policy that's just come out, in terms of saying that 70% of new licenses will be issued to Black people. And of course, you've got people jumping on and saying, how can we do this according to race or whatever? But they're not talking about the fact that 60% of our water is already allocated to agriculture. Of that 60%, 10% are commercial white farmers, historically white farmers, that control 90% of the water. So small emerging farmers are not getting any of the water. So we've got to change that policy, but also change how we use water. So here's some of our vision. I know I am running out of time. The CJCM vision for water commons. I said we must define the water commons together, collectively, and understand it. Everybody must understand what a water commons is. We need to look at climate extremes, droughts, floods, through rethinking urban and rural spatial design. I mean, the way we are still designing, sure, I can't believe we have really smart people designing things, and then you look at the new developments, you think they just lost the plot, really. So like in terms of retention and overflow of micro dams, reservoirs, channeling for overflow into public gardens, harvesting of an institution, like so households, like have that all businesses, local government, and keeping gutters clear. So basic things can be done, which we can all start, doing in some way or another. Like I saw a group yesterday, and I know some of these things feel like plasters on a bigger, like on an amputation, but they can be used cleverly. So stormwater drains, for example, they completely blocked. Humans, we are part of the problem. We throw rubbish into our stormwater drains. We throw construction rubble. And so people started cleaning out these stormwater drains, and that is something that we need to think about as solutions that we do at a local level. Water awareness campaigns to end abuse and waste, and that links into what I'm saying in terms of local solutions. We have to reuse, recycle, rethink. We can't carry on the way that we are. There are new technologies that are not water-based toilet technologies that can be used. We need to look at those things. We can't shut down technologies without having a good understanding of what it is. But of course, there are those like desalination, which is serious problems. So we have to have that kind of awareness and understand that we must start unpacking those technologies and not allow others to do it for us. Okay, so tackling polluters through people's inspectorate. So that is something that is important as well, is how do we, there is an inspectorate, how do we make sure that civil society is part of that whole process? We need to create local water commons committees in communities, build back infrastructure for climate justice and climate jobs, management of dams and early warning systems. We are really sitting on a time bomb in terms of dams right now, that if I can tell you that 90% of them have not had any maintenance or safety checks in over 5 years, maybe more. Establish new institutions. So water court, I love the idea of a water court. I mean, we need to not just, charge municipalities, but people for polluting, like the mayor. The mayor must be charged in Hammanskraal. We need we have a water ombudsman. So we have to have a dedicated water commissioner in the Human Rights Commission. I think it's important. They overstretch at the moment. There's a lot of people working on water and environment. Well, few people working on water and environment, but not enough. And they need to be given some teeth. Regulator for pricing, so there's no abuse in local government. Then policing, penalties, and prohibitions is something. So prohibit polluting water rivers, but also oceans. It's almost accepted that sewage is going to flow into the oceans, and it's happening in Cape Town. So Cape Town cannot get away with it as well. We have a blue scorpions. I don't know if you know that. And the equivalent, the green scorpions is the environmental monitors or managements that can actually, they have the right to arrest, search, seizure. But blue scorpions, we need to beef them up a little bit so that they can do better work. I have been working with some of them really good, but not enough of them. And then just to say that the National Department of Water and Sanitation, with the new minister, has put into place a few proposals to change things, and proposal for a water regulator and an ombudsman. So there are some good changes and like good thinking that has come out in the last year and a half. We need to unpack that more and see how to push for some of those things to actually happen. Because at this stage, the National Department of Water and Sanitation, I think are experiencing blockages along the way, and we need to see how to unblock them. It's government's a problem, but not in this regard. We need to also see how to make sure that our vision becomes their vision. Some of the obstacles. Of course, it's a failed state. I think it's a very, very failed state, which then gives rise to populism. And you'll have, like with Hammanskraal, I was counting 10 every day almost, because you would have every political party, even ones that just started yesterday, wanting to go and be in the forefront of Hammanskraal. Even Rise Mzansi wanted to find out where to test, how to test water. And I'm like, it's just annoying, and we have to be aware that that's going to happen. A very aggressive private sector. So as the system is failing, you have no idea of the amount of people that call me to sell me water systems. So you have these packaged sanitation plants and packaged water treatment plants that people are selling. You have a big influx of Israeli businesses wanting to do desalination. So we have to, it's everywhere. And the whole thing is about privatization of water, and it's hitting us from all sides. And if we are not vigilant and we're not vocal about this, we're going to get up one day and it's going to be controlled, and we'll have no way to turn it back. And let's also be honest, we have a very weak civil society. Grassroots organizations and movements are weak. We're working in silos and we're competing for funding, but also let's talk about climate. We have the Climate Justice Charter, we have the Climate Justice Coalition, we have the Climate Action Network, and we have the Climate Justice Network. And none of them are speaking to each other in only in certain respects. And I think when I say speaking, I mean doing things together, which I think just creates shows how weakness. And I'm quite tired of that, actually. There's no time to, we have to build and we have to work together, and we have to find at least one campaign we can all sing from the same sheet. Anyway, that's my bugbear for the day. And then with climate shocks, high levels of pollution and poor access, because every time we're trying to make progress in terms of a policy or in terms of action, we hit by another El Nino, which is what we're going to be having soon. And it's going to be harder. It's going to be worse than before. So then people are dealing with on the ground issues. There's high levels of pollution. There's nobody doing the checks and balances on that. There's the access to water is getting worse. All of that is an obstacle. So how do we deal with building and having these things that we have to worry about? And then the state of our water resources is just completely in a mess. I mean, there's so much pollution. I sometimes think, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to actually turn the tide on the levels of pollution that we have? And I wrote that the obstacle is identifying the solution and keeping on track without becoming overwhelmed or paralyzed by the size, because I do feel that sometimes. And I'm sure many of us do in all our work. That's what we will experience as activists, but hey, we keep moving, right? That's what makes us activists and part of this movement. So an alternative policy on its own could become as bad as present policies. It must be accompanied by education and mobilization. Comrades, we have to get out there. We have to be old school activists, and we have to be activists that walk through our shoes and go to people and speak to people, not just in workshops, but door to door. We have to start doing that, and to ensure that people are empowered with the knowledge to make informed decisions. This is what we have covered in terms of our policy. And yes, there are obstacles, but there's far more at stake to give up. And we all know that. And that's why we're here gathering on this day. And building the CJCM has never been more important than necessary. And so I leave you with that. I know some of it sounded bleak, but I think that the fact that we have these policies is a step in the right direction, and hope that we can move closer to our vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferial. That was a really beautiful presentation. Very informative, especially for those of us who are not from the water sector. And yeah, just full of interesting things to think about. Yeah, anyway, let me not get too get too carried away by commenting, because we're a little bit behind time. So I'm going to hand over to one day, who's going to give us an overview of what we call the CJ deal. I'm sure he will give an introduction himself, so I won't go on there. Or maybe if he needs a few moments to set up. So the CJ deal is an overarching policy instrument. It tries to pull together the different strands of the climate justice charter, movement to give a more overarching framework, looking at some of the issues around financing as well. So all of the changes that we have ambition around, like how do those come together, basically. So it's a very large project, and Awande always has the great challenge of trying to explain it in a very short amount of time. So Awande, we're about 15 minutes late already. If you could keep it as brief as possible. I wonder if while they are getting set up, if anybody would like to, we will have some time for discussion later, but if anybody would like to respond or ask a question to Ferial in the meantime.
Sorry, Stacey, can I just add that when the
Of course.
policy is released, there's a lot more statistics and like information people need. I have to jump off in about 2 minutes, so.
Great, okay. So if anybody has a burning question for Ferial, this is the moment. I think you might need to raise your hand if you are online, but okay. Otherwise, from my side, Ferial, thank you so much. Really, so many different. It's amazing to see how many different areas of policy need to be looked at, and so many things that touch onto water, and how we really need to start thinking in a different way about so many of the things that we've become accustomed to. So really fascinating, and I really thank you for your efforts to join us, considering that you're not feeling well as well. And I wish you a relaxing rest of your day.
Thanks, comrades, and sorry I can't be there, and I look forward to receiving the presentations as well, to look at Awande's presentation, which looks amazingly interesting. Thank you,
Great.
comrades. Have a great day.
Thank you, Ferial. Please go ahead, Awande, when you're.
Thank you, Stacey. Sorry, we were sorting out some connection issues, but I will also try to be time conscious. So basically, as Stacey indicated, thank you. The climate justice deal puts together the vision, alternatives, values, and principles of the Charter into policy and macroeconomic form. Not only does it put it into form, but it analyzes and takes the perspectives with regards to what's going on currently, the crisis we face into the future, but also seriously trying to grapple with the historical legacies of apartheid, colonialism, and capitalist extraction that has led to the climate crisis. So I think all the speakers who've spoken this far have pretty much given a proper contextual piece into how we've arrived at the point that we do, arrived at the point which we are in currently. But the climate justice deal tries to go a step further and seeks to synthesize all those perspectives whilst imbuing it with the climate justice charter perspective. So the overview of the document is that we begin by looking at climate risk of 1.5 degrees overshoot for South Africa and climate injustice. So what does that mean? Failed Afro-neoliberal macroeconomic policy and the polycrisis of socio-ecological reproduction, basically looking at our current trajectory of the orthodoxy of our current socio-economic planning and macroeconomic structuring of the economy, but also the socio-ecological crisis that we're facing at the same time, looking towards an eco and life-centric macroeconomics to accelerate the deep just transition. So going beyond the current orthodoxy of how things are done in economic and general policy terms, but seeking to look at some of the other ways in which we can structure our society and economy in a way that is life-affirming. The climate justice deal for South Africa and deep democratic systemic reforms, So kind of explaining how the Climate Justice Charter in the form of a climate justice deal seeks to address all these prior problems that we touched on, and then key democratic systemic reforms to accelerate the deep just transition. So that basically the policy thrusts, which Ferial was speaking about in the previous presentation, how these connect with the overall broader vision of a climate justice deal. So I'll just touch on those briefly, but the point is to give a broad overview. And then challenges to accelerate the deep just transition, looking at how the climate justice deal can act as a new social contract for South Africa, and macroeconomic democratic systemic reforms, which I spoke about above in the thrust, how those come together. So we begin with the latest science by looking at the latest IPCC synthesis reports, its confirmation of the accelerated heating which our planet is currently facing, since we've already gone past the 1.1 degree mark of the pre-industrial period. Looking at what the report states with regards to how different parts of the world will be affected by the climate crisis, and then also the way in which the report highlights the urgency with which we need to address the climate crisis. And then touching on the ways in which the report calls out for deep and rapid reduction in greenhouse gases, the way in which it touches on transitioning to renewable energy, decarbonization more broadly, and some of the other things that the report calls for. The emphasis that it puts on adaptation measures to help address the unavoidable impacts of climate crisis. I think that's something which we don't speak about too often in terms of that it's already happening. And it is a bit of a pessimistic perspective with regards to addressing that, but it is an important aspect of the work of climate justice in terms of facing head on some of the impacts which we've already locked in due to our previous behavior. And then also looking at the way in which the report speaks for the immediate sustained action needed to address the climate crisis. In addition to this, also look at the future climate risks that science, this report and others put forward with regards to countries such as ours, such as the risk of more and severe frequent weather events such as droughts and floods, which we've seen more recently in our part of the world, what rising sea levels and melting glaciers, the ways in which they will impact our parts of the world and other coastal areas, changing weather patterns, what that means for agricultural and food systems, and then the way in which climate change will exacerbate existing health challenges. In addition to this, we also look at some of the other long-term emissions impacts that great developing countries will face. So we're looking at the significant long-term impacts that global climate will have in terms of its contribution to some of the shortcomings that we face, such as limited financial capacity, such as developed countries, the technological resources that we lack, and the economic path dependencies that some of our countries are already on, particularly economies such as South Africa, which are already so heavily coal and fossil centric with regards to its developmental trajectory. And then we also highlight the opportunities that we have to leapfrog in terms of our developmental agenda or our macroeconomic needs, if we do embrace some of the technologies that are required and methods and economic perspectives required to deal with more sustainably transformative practices to confront the climate crisis. We also look at inequality, what climate inequality means, the way climate inequality affects not just South Africa, but regionally and globally also. We refer to the Oxfam reports, which touches on that, but also has a deep dive in terms of the South African context, South Africa being a microcosm of global inequality and global climate inequality. So that's the main part there, just to set the kind of context. So that's the surface kind of introductory perspective that sets us into then understanding the socioeconomic and macroeconomic context we're in of the failed Afro-neoliberal policy and the polycrisis of socio-ecological reproduction. So when we talk about the Afro-neoliberal state, we're talking basically about the post-apartheid period of South Africa and some of the policies that our government has put in place to try manage capital risk, but also to try and make our country a more attractive space for capital. So we're looking at some of the international dimensions with regards to the reduction of certain policies that would have been in place, trade policies like liberalizing our trade, allowing for a lot of South African companies to offshore, also the way in which we've tied ourselves to the global economic context, the way in which monetary policy is controlled, how money is controlled in this country, particularly with regards to inflation targeting, the ways in which we've dismantled the self-sufficiency of our state sectors, which are required to address the crisis of the coming crisis of the climate crisis, the ongoing crisis, I should actually say, and fostering the way in which the state also fostered a culture of capitalist enrichment also. So in addition to this, looking at those factors, what it's caused, particularly high levels of income inequality, the persistent poverty and unemployment that it's contributed to, the limited investment in social services that it's also led to, and the factors that has, in a sense, kind of germinated in our society. In addition to this, also the high levels of debt and dependence on foreign investment that our country has, and also some of the other macroeconomic trends that we've spoken about, also kind of comparing those in relation to South Africa's challenges with regards to economic growth and development that the government has put forward. So this is then connected to the concept of polycrisis of social ecological reproduction, where basically we're speaking about the way in which various interrelated crises, human and natural crises, intersect and come together. And basically this concept recognizes that social and ecological systems are interconnected and that the crisis affecting them cannot be addressed in isolation from each other. So we're tying that context of the post-apartheid policy that our government has put in place with these ongoing polycrisis that we're facing in our society and is being faced in the natural world. And this crisis of socio-ecological reproduction that is worsening touches on the unemployment crisis and precaritization, the rolling electricity blackout problem with load shedding, worsening hunger, which we see in our country, water inequality and stress, such as what Farrell was speaking about in her presentation, and then things such as structural problems that are exhibited, for example, such as the excess deaths that we saw during the COVID-19 lockdown period, which are examples of our government's inability to deal with crisis. And then also these crises extend to the realm of the household, which is seen in the violence against women and children, which is endemic in our country. In addition to this, we also touch on the carbon lock-ins, what risk that poses for our country's ability to address this crisis, and the ongoing climate crisis and its worsening, the way in which these lock-ins will exacerbate these crises in relation to our fossil fuel dependency, the feedback loop that is being created by this, and then also the risk that it has for our ability to transition to renewable energy and more sustainable practices. So from that perspective, then the document goes on towards eco and life-centric macroeconomics. So here is basically, after taking all that context of where we're coming from and what we're grappling with, and then putting forward the solutions that are in line with what the Charter puts forward in its perspective. And basically to try give a perspective of the fact that there is doom and gloom with regards to the seriousness of the climate crisis. There really are things on the table that we can implement now and also build towards in the medium and long term. So it's not necessarily all futile. What's futile is just the will to implement these processes. And so reiterating that the Charter calls for a life-centered approach to economics, but going beyond mainstream economics, and then now describing what going beyond mainstream economics looks like. And obviously economic growth is something which is, if you follow politics and you're aware of politics or even finance or economics, it's the be all and end all of what is supposed to basically structure how things are going well. So if they're going well, that means growth targets are being met. And if they're not, it means that we're not growing. And basically what we're calling for is a move away from economic growth being the sole marker of what increased prosperity looks like, societally speaking. So focusing on some of the key limitations of growth-centered macroeconomics, particularly its environmental concerns, the way in which it contributes to environmental and ecological degradation, social inequality that has existed and has been exacerbated in 40 years or so that we've seen of world economies growing at record rates, but social inequality has also skyrocketed in the same period. The resource constraints that stop us from being able to grow infinitely, and then economic instability that also occurs with some of these growth-centered approaches of boom and bust. And then we speak about the way in which we seek to address these limitations by putting forward alternative economic models that prioritize sustainability, social equality, and environmental protection over just solely GDP. And then we also look at some of the other alternative economic models that frame and offer different ways of measuring societal prosperity in a way which enables resilience and equitable economic practices. So there's things such as steady state economics, circular economy has some useful tools, sharing economy and solidarity economy also have some useful tools that we can learn from, regenerative economics, local economy, as I said, solidarity economy, which has its holistic approach to economic development. Going further into some of these, such as solidarity economy and the promises that it holds with regards to being able to maintain and also sustain well-being in time of crisis. And then we also look at other factors that we can take into account with regards to how we measure prosperity. So a natural commons approach and extinction rates, being able to measure the ways in which we protect the natural commons and expanding the natural commons, and also how we minimize extinction rates, currently being in one of the highest extinction events that our planet has seen. Ecological limits, being able to measure ecological limits, boundaries and cycles is also an important approach to the climate justice deals macroeconomic framework, and then a life index to measure quality of life, happiness, and the state of the natural commons also. And then all of this comes together basically in these thrusts. So I won't be able to go into them too deeply due to time, but just to run through with regards to what the thrusts are, and these thrusts will be given more fleshed out explanation in the different policies, such as the one that Ferial on previously and what Charles will speak on in his presentation. So the first being public and common services. This deals fundamentally with inequality, climate, social inequality, things such as UBIG, democratic public utilities, and climate relief funds help with regards to frontline response. Climate jobs, which cut across all the policies, the way in which they can be implemented within the next 5 years, short term would be required to help oversee this, a national emergency management agency, because we will be facing more climate emergencies. Programs can help as low carbon work and their importance as a climate job also. Local and regional climate jobs programs that will be required, and then a climate works program also to help with the unemployment crisis, but also as a means of skilling and drawing in unemployed youths and other people who want to be reskilled and to do the work which will be required, because there will be a lot of work required in the adaptation and mitigation and transformative regeneration that the climate justice deal puts forward. Rapid phasing out of fossil fuels for socially and community-owned renewable energy. So harnessing the social change potential of renewable energy through energy democracy, what the principles of energy democracy are and how they will reform our energy system, which is so central to our colonial structure and our colonial history, but also to our legacy as Africa's top polluter. Public participation, the role of that in our new energy system, decentralized models versus centralized models, the role for both of them, and then energy cooperatives and public ownership. Zero waste and eco-centric manufacturing, looking at universal sustainable infrastructure to help increase investments to low carbon infrastructure and innovation, reducing our consumption, but also the other institutions which will be required to make these zero waste and eco-centric manufacturing initiatives possible. Looking at the conversion and repurposing of all industries, key sectors, but also key industries which will have to move beyond, but ones which will also have to double down on, particularly ones which have useful technologies for the climate crisis. So to underlie that, that's also looking at environmental technologies. So some of the things that Pharaoh was speaking about prior, for example, with regards to addressing some of the wastage that happens in our water infrastructure, some of the investment which will be required to secure that, but then also to expand and repurpose it to address our current consumption concerns. And then also just to emphasize how zero waste and eco-centric manufacturing are connected, with regards to some of the other technologies which we'll be looking at, which would have to be produced and manufactured locally, and some of the other overlaps, eco-housing and transition towns, dealing with the housing crisis, looking at eco-housing, building materials, and also expanding what the concept of eco-housing means, addressing apartheid spatial planning to create more resilience in our communities, centralized and decentralized urban planning for eco-communities, and then also the whole entire concept of transition towns. And then we also look at finance. So basically beginning by looking at what our government has kind of cordoned off as the amount of money they'll need for its transition, which is a 1.5 trillion investment plan over the next 5 years. And then comparing that with our current balance sheet of our state finances, taking into consideration things such as the ESCOM debt, the promises that were made with regards to developed nations for developing countries such as ours from the Paris Climate Agreement, monetary policy, our current central bank mandates, and also some of the debates around that, fiscal policy, the kind of stimulus spending required for CJ deal processes, the kind of borrowing which would be required, and then also with regards to things such as our foreign reserves and how those could be used. And then restructuring that balance sheet. So basically speaking about our total assets, the total debt that we also have, how that's balanced, organizations and institutions such as the Public Investment Corporation and the African Development Bank, how do they fit in? What role can they play? An unemployment insurance fund, also what role can it play? Taxes, I think that's something which comes up a lot when you're speaking about climate programs, and obviously they will have a role in this, particularly going just beyond carbon taxes, but other kind of taxes that we will need, and then also prescribed asset requirements for public and private pension funds to help invest in the deep just transition. And then finally, democratic planning and a people-driven climate justice state, basically looking at the new kind of democratic institutions which will be required to make a climate justice deal a real its real vision of democratic implementation realized. So how the climate justice deal acts as a response to institutional crisis in our states, the traditions of democratic planning in other countries and what we can learn from them, climate emergency democratic planning, so new institutions coordinating the approach of implementing these programs just outside of the government, but also in communities, coordination of existing institutions, repurposing them, such as what we're speaking about in the previous section about finance, but also with regards to the other institutional actors, regional and national climate justice deal planning councils. So how those should be structured, how those should be thought about, ways in which those could be implemented, and then institutions which would have to be implemented or introduced or created for a climate justice deal, such as a Climate Justice Deal Act in Parliament, refitting and formatting the Presidential Climate Commission, repurposing institutions such as NEDLAC and other national intergovernmental planning councils. And I think I'll just end there, time permitting. I think this is just a consolidated perspective around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Awande. And that was really very comprehensive. And I really appreciate seeing how it's developing this policy over time. I'm going to hand straight over to Charles because we're running very far behind time. Charles is going to speak to us today about some of the CJ tools that have been developed for use by communities.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Let me just quickly share my screen. And if time was permitting, Stacey, I would break out into a song. However, due to time constraints, I'll go straight to the presentation.
Oh, shame.
But let me start by saying, long live the spirit of Fikile Nchangase, long live. Long live the spirit of Fikile Nchangase, long live. Mam Fikile Nchangase, for those who do not know, was an activist who was assassinated on the 22nd of October. Those who were assassinating her thought they could silence the community of Mfolozi and silence the country around environmental activism or climate justice activism. But they did not know that Fikile Nchangase would multiply and give birth to a generation of young people who are going to come out, reclaim their country, and stand up for what is right. So long live the spirit of Fikile Nchangase, long live. Long live. So over the years, the Climate Justice Charter movement has developed several tools. The climate justice deal that Awanda was talking about, it's part of the tools that the CJCM has developed over the years. All of these tools are meant to deepen and accelerate the just transition. You know, climate justice activism can be burdensome and stressful. However, when you are involved in building alternatives to the current system, alternatives to the patriarchy that we see on a daily basis, alternatives to the destruction of our environment, alternatives to the lack of jobs and the lack of hope that we see in our society, then it's truly inspiring. And that is what the Climate Justice Charter movement is all about. It's about building all of these systemic alternatives, addressing the root causes of the problems that we have. So moving beyond calls for climate change towards systems change, moving beyond mere targeting of carbon emissions towards systemic alterations of the way and the manner in which our systems are operating, and challenging those in power who are now beginning to capture some of our activist language and are beginning to implement false solutions to the climate crisis. These are false solutions that result in the rich getting richer while the poor are continuously getting poorer. So the CJCM is about building grassroots-based solutions to the problems that we face. So over the years, we have developed several tools, but recently we have launched 2 policies. Now, these policies come from the Climate Justice Charter's systemic alternatives for transformative change. The policy that Ferial was talking on earlier on, she was presenting on, is part of this policy work to take the systemic alternative visions and turn them into implementable policies. So on the 22nd of April, which was Earth Day, we launched our Rights of Nature policy. You can find it on our CJCM webpage. It's about stopping the 6th mass extinction that we are seeing. The policy proposes several systemic alternatives like bioregional governance, decolonial convivial conservation, banning of canned hunting, how we protect our biodiversity, how we protect our water commons, and how we protect our land commons. Following from that, on the 18th of May, we held an assembly with workers and trade unions, and we launched the eco-mobility and clean energy public transport system. So this policy is about accelerating eco-mobility and clean energy public transport alternatives. Because if you look at the just transition narrative, it's about moving towards electric cars. But of course, that is a false solution because we simply do not have the minerals that are required to give everyone an electric car. So the policy is addressing all of these false solutions that are being implemented. But it's also addressing the way in which we build, the way that we have built our cities around a car-based transport system. So moving away from that car-based transport system towards renewable energy public transport systems. So you can find this policy also on our CJCM webpage. It has been launched for public engagement. You can engage with the policy and send your feedback to the CJCM. So we've developed several tools like the People's Planning Activist Guide for a Just Transition. The purpose of the tool basically is to underline what is necessary in a deep just transition. Normally you hear talk about a just transition, but if you look at the CJCM, we're talking about a deep just transition because it's not just a transition from fossil fuels to renewables, but it's a transition in how we manage resources. It's a transition of the power dynamics. It's also a transition of planning and how we build our cities. So it's to enable activists to use this particular tool for just transition plans in their cities, for just transition plans in their workplaces, for just transition plans in their communities and stuff like that. So it lays the basis to develop a suite of other tools as well that are following from building the just transition. So it introduces the climate and ecological crisis that we are living in. I want to touch on that. It outlines on how to use the charter as a tool for the deep just transition, how we advance democratic planning in our cities. Because one of the things we have to do in our climate justice activism is to reclaim democracy and to build a democratic ethos as well as a constitutional ethos within our society, because that is largely missing. A lot of people feel that their votes do not count. A lot of people have been disenfranchised by the political process, but we have to reclaim democracy so that we are part of the decision making and decisions are not made on our behalf without us being present. So the sixth module is about climate justice visioning, planning and activism in communities, in workplaces, in your sectors, in your local government. How can you as an activist in your community, for example, build other activists, train and capacitate other activists? The seventh module is about accelerating the deep just transition in communities, in workplaces, in local government. This tool is also available on our CJCM webpage. The next tool that we launched was the Let's Feed Ourselves Through Food Sovereignty Activist Guide. It's made up of case studies from different communities. It shows how people are building food sovereignty alternatives where they are, because South Africa is a starving country. I mean, if you look at the average cost of a basic nutritious basket, it's standing at over 5,000 rands. Now, this is in a country where over 12 million people are unemployed. So we are basically living in a hunger crisis, and we have to build these systemic alternatives from below. So this tool shows how communities and different peoples are building these alternatives from below. It says inspirational stories. Yes. But those are just some of the tools we have recently launched. Over the years, we've worked on a number of tools. The People's Food Sovereignty Act, for example, is about transforming the way in which we govern our food, the way in which we regulate the use of our land resources. I mean, South Africa's law regarding to the regulation of pesticides and insecticides was actually written in 1947. It has not been changed since 1947. And if you look, we have 67 pesticides that are being used in South Africa, which are banned in other countries. So basically, we have a very toxic food production system. Now, the Food Sovereignty Act addresses those issues, but it goes further than that, because it calls for a food sovereignty-oriented plan towards food production. We have a land justice tool. We have a seed-saving tool. We have a water tool. We also have a tool, food sovereignty for the right to food. We also have a tool for building worker cooperatives that are so essential, because we will need worker cooperatives, for example, to own energy systems, to own renewable energy systems. And if you look, one of the biggest challenges facing cooperatives in South Africa is that they are not capacitated. So they are started and they fail. And you find that a lot of cooperatives don't know where to look, but this tool addresses that. It was developed over a number of years, over different consultations with cooperatives, as well as individuals working in that field. Our seed saving tool as well about building seed banks, as well as, of course, the climate justice charter. Thank you so much, Stacey. Over to you.
Thank you, Charles. That was a great overview. And as everybody can see, I think some really relevant pieces of work there that, yeah, I think maybe, I don't know if anyone on the call has had specific experience, or they're in the room, of working with a community using one of the tools. Charles, for giving us an overview of the movement. over the last few months. So now we have no more time, but I think we should give people an opportunity. Well, in terms of the actual program, the time has been used up. But I think it would be great to give at least people an opportunity if they would like to respond to the first two sessions, any of the amazing parallels that we've seen between the points raised by the youth in the youth concerns session or in the response from the CJCM. If anybody has any questions or would like to raise any points or make any points related to those two sessions. If you could, Charles, facilitate if anyone in the room is wanting to say anything.
I don't think there's any on this side either, Stacey.
Okay, so I think there's nobody. Maybe we to the book launch, which I think is really exciting. I wonder, you're going to explain to us a little bit about the book, and then we will get some of the contributors to speak.
Thank you, Stacey. So the final part of our assembly today is the launch of this book, People's and Workers' Climate Justice Charter Futures for South Africa. This book has been, correct me if I'm wrong, 3 years in the making. And it is a compilation of articles and writings from a range of people, activists, youth, students, workers. And the main themes of this book, as you'll see when you do get your hands on one, is climate justice perspectives being the first one, climate justice struggles, and then finally systemic alternatives. So I think this book is a great synthesis of everything we've spoken about today, because in it you have a vision, grassroots vision, presented by people where they are from their own experiences of their climate justice struggles, but also their climate justice perspectives in the sense of balancing the reality of what we face with regards to the challenge ahead in dealing with the climate crisis versus the systemic alternatives and paths that are out there for us to traverse this in a just and life-affirming way. So it's a book of hope. It's the opposite of the doom and gloom. And I feel very privileged to have the opportunity to have, in some small way, contributed to its coming together. But I think that the lion's share of praise and thanks goes to everyone who contributed and wrote something for this book. A big thank you to Jane also for her tireless work also in helping to organize and see this across the line. And then also another thanks to Charles, who's also in the room, who also has a contribution in this book. So without wasting any more time, I think I'd like to hand over to two speakers who will speak, contributed to this book, Tiamo and Matthew. So Tiamo, if you're ready, thank you very much.
Hi there, everyone. I also can't turn my camera on. We're out and about here in Bloemfontein. Thank you so much for today's presentations. It's been quite insightful, as usual. I like the way you prefaced the book, a book of hope. I haven't yet read through the entire book, but I have read all the articles that were published on the Daily Maverick website as part of the series. I think that was a really powerful series that we did. I'll just speak a bit about my personal contribution, and then I also hope to also have a message of hope that I'll transfer to everyone. So firstly, I wrote about natural building, which is a building technique that indigenous knowledge systems have had for a very long time. There is a project here just outside of Bloemfontein that uses natural building techniques. For a short while, they were working with the university. Now it's mostly just the community that does something called post-natural building. So natural building is all about using natural materials like cob or adobe, which is a mixture of clay soil, manure, straw, and other materials to create strong surfaces like bricks that you can use. Post-natural just means that we're adding waste in the process. So you're taking recycled tires, eco bricks, which is bricks made of stuffed plastics, and you're using that in the building process. So you're both using natural materials to build and reducing the carbon emissions for dwelling structures. And then at the same time, you're also addressing the waste issue within informal settlements. So you've got two great things that you're doing for the environment there. Now, of course, the approach that many cities have taken is to build skyscrapers and huge buildings for which natural building just isn't possible. And so there's a certain decision taken about what we build that leads to a certain building method. Secondly, universities that train engineers and train architects don't really speak much about natural building. If you have a more progressive curriculum, maybe they'll just mention it in passing, but many people who build in our society don't even know about building using these methods. So the project also brought architects and students in human settlements from the University of the Free State to see the project. But I think the most important thing about this article, which relates to the policy objectives of the Charter, is that South Africa doesn't even have a guideline for how you can get approval to build with natural building methods if that's something you wanted to do. Now, the United States, this bastion of empire and tyranny, and by and large, at least through its actions, much less committed to environmental justice than we're supposed to be, does actually have a document about how to build with natural materials. And you can get approval for a natural building through something called the Green Codes. And it's just interesting that South Africa doesn't even have a document that might detail how one could even create a natural building dwelling if one even wanted to. So the article was just addressing that there's these legislative blocks that make that difficult, and that maybe the best place to start is by putting together a regulatory framework for natural building that can be implemented in legislation that would enable communities, especially informal settlements, to do this legally and with the protection of state, and in ways that ensure that they don't have to sit around waiting for an RDP to be built for them. So you also address the right to housing, which our constitution declares. But by and large, the most important thing is that you prevent the construction industry, which is one of the largest contributors to climate change, from continuing to guzzle carbon into the atmosphere. There must be a different approach to how we build. I mean, just recently, I found out that our municipality has a series of buildings that are scheduled for destruction or demolishment because they're old. I don't have the exact schematics and details about why they're being demolished, but they've been scheduled to be demolished. And once they are demolished, the municipality will have to replace those structures. And there's an entire forum of architects right now that are convening to discuss what they might do, how they might replace those buildings. Now imagine if there was a regulatory framework for natural building. It would empower this municipality and other municipalities to use natural building methods to build dwellings or other structures. But right now they can't, even if they wanted to. So the policy alternative for housing for the construction industry, which would be emitting less carbon into the environment and would also create much more sustainable livelihoods. Natural building methods are also ones that community members can get involved in. I mean, people young can help collect waste and other people can collect tires. It can be a real community effort. Those aren't even available through legislative, legal, or formal means. It's only through informal means that such structures can be built. And it's not even that these structures are dangerous. They are very climate resilient. When Cyclone Idai struck, they actually had to build these structures as climate resilient structures because the structures that were built were not climate resilient. And so the worries and concerns about these sorts of structures don't yet seem to be quite founded, especially because not just the US, there are other countries that allow such natural building. So, I mean, that was the gist of the article that I wrote for Daily Maverick. It wasn't a long article. I think my representation of it here is probably longer than the read itself. So I do implore you to read this and other articles that were both on the Daily Maverick website, but also in the book. And then message of hope. What I value about the Climate Justice Charter, and I think many of us value it for this reason, is we aren't all experts in a lot of these fields, and there's a lot that we aren't aware of, but the Climate Justice Charter does a good job to explain the science of the climate crisis, but also the alternatives and how these alternatives might work. And obviously it's up to us to practicalize it, but at the very least, we can see all the various linkages, which are, you know, a very comprehensive plan to transition, which obviously creates hope, because it's very obvious that you can see all the different areas in which we can change the way in which we live that can avert the climate crisis. So I want to issue that this book is something that I will definitely continue to share. It's a message of hope, as I one day summarized, but at the same time, it's very specific, it's very concrete, so to say. And I do hope that the book spreads. I'm not really sure what the distribution strategy is, but it would be great if we could have a book launch here at one of the universities in Bloemfontein as well, if that's practicable. Definitely, that's something I'd look forward to. And to everyone who came out to the conference today, thank you so much for joining the struggle for climate justice. And I need to continue.
Thank you, Siamo. Thank you for your contribution, but also thank you for the work that you're doing right now in your community. Siamo entered into the Climate Justice Charter process as a student, but has expanded to do a lot of important work in the community in Bloemfontein, challenging the perception of what can be achieved at the local scale. So we thank you, Tiamo, for your work and also for being an example and a beacon of what it means to be a climate justice activist. So next we have Matthew Wingfield. Matthew, you may go when you're ready.
Cool, thanks for Monday. You can hear me okay?
Yes, can you hear Matthew clearly?
I can scream.
I think you could.
Now I'm self-conscious because I'm now going to be really big on your screen there. But hi everyone, and it's a pleasure to be asked to just give a brief account of my chapter, but also some of the other work I've done with Climate Justice Charter. And yeah, I just also want to echo Chiama's call to say, hope is very important in these spaces. On a call last night about activism, someone released a book, and people were just talking about burnout, and they are all okay. Everything's okay.
Okay, you're back.
Did I disappear?
Yeah, I knew you're back now.
Okay, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, that's weird. Okay, so really, I just want to say I think hope is extremely important, and I really appreciate that you underlined that, Wanda and Chiamo. But yeah, it's just compared to our first speakers raised the issue of, people talk about Greta Thunberg and all of this, but I think what the Climate Justice Charter has done and continues to do is highlight the work of important people in South Africa, right? We don't really, it's important to look at what other people are doing and understand and be motivated by that and be inspired. But we have more than enough really, really inspiring and strong activists in this country. And they are highlighted through this forum and in all these other meetings. But yeah, I just want to say, the false solution question is so important, and no wonder was highlighting how, and Charles have highlighted how universities, and that's the space I've worked in, but corporations, universities have adopted this language that we are using, just transition and so on, and green solutions. And of course, it can be critiqued often as greenwashing, but they are learning the language that we're mobilizing. Charles, is everything okay? Huh? Okay. Yeah, they are mobilizing the language that we are using here as well. So that's an important consideration to take. Well, important consideration to have when we're working in these spaces. But okay, let me speak very briefly then to the chapter. Well, the chapter I have, the article I wrote, and I agree with Chiama. Mine was also very brief, but I appreciated been able to make that contribution. But firstly, I just want to say universities are, of course, a microcosm of society, and some universities, like the one I am from, and others in this country, have a history that's very deeply interlinked with the apartheid state and the colonial state, and certainly the apartheid state, and how they functioned is very much ingrained in how these universities continue to function, right? So they are these spaces of conservatism and of expert rule and stuff like that, and lack of consideration from students, and almost a lack of democratic institution principles. But so my chapter really looked at, while we have all the climate science, which is becoming, well, we've already gone past that point where it's already convincing, but taking that to universities, that's basically how universities are framing this issue. We just need to write articles, we need to fund good research, and that is an important element. But however, I would argue that, and I argued in this chapter, this article, that while research is important, students being part of and participating in decision-making about what the university is, what it can be, who is driving that process. We've already spoken about that, and other speakers have raised that issue on different levels. But at the university as well, it's important with the students aren't just students or customers of this business that come, get a degree, and then move on. Who is being part of these decision-making processes to shape this university, to address the climate crisis? In the meetings I've had with my university, Stellenbosch University, with a whole bunch of students, has been in many ways sort of a tokenism kind of meeting, where they just say, okay, we'll listen to you, but nothing really will be considered. And actually, I've run into many obstacles at the university, and I feel like this is happening across the board at all the universities in the country. A big resistance to the voice of students. Really, it's often the professors that are, and their research really, rather than their concerns on a personal level, but their research is what might be driving some change at universities, and that is a problem. So I try to say that students are important change makers in these spaces. They aren't just customers, nor are they just people there to get degrees, and that's an argument that can be drawn from universities to various communities. As citizens, and Ferrier was talking about this, around policy. We aren't just people that, and citizens aren't just people that, get policy delivered, and then we just have to live in accordance to that kind of policy. We are meant to be part of these decision-making processes, and we are meant to shape what the rules that constitute our lives. I think that's very important. And then I'll give you one case study of how we use the tools of the Climate Justice Charter, and especially the people planning for a deep just transition at Stellenbosch University. So while I went to the university, and we've had some productive meetings, and there's quite a bit of interest around the Climate Justice Charter and climate just futures at the university, I felt like there wasn't actually a real reflection of why the institution is set up as it is, who makes decisions, and those kind of discussions. So what we did was host this session, started almost directly by the DJT tool, and we ran a bunch of students through this process. Who makes decisions? Who are those decisions for? What impacts does it have for different groups in society, at universities, in your communities, in your res, and so on? And we try to really underscore the point that there is a severe and problematic lack of consideration of what student voice is in shaping universities across the board. And that's not only climate justice, but about inclusion policy around a range of issues. And the food gardens across all these universities that are integrated into the Climate Justice Charter, and the representatives like Chiamo, people at WITS, and etc., and myself at Stellenbosch University, that is also a moment, that is also a mode of saying, well, we don't want you to solve these issues in the way that you're doing it, but there are other opportunities, there are other models to use, and we are going to show you how to do that. So that's what we've done at Stellenbosch. But really, it is just to say, often you might feel not capable of taking on this issue and having these discussions with people that are, in decision-making corridors. but the Climate Justice Charter and the tools that are given, the DJT tool that I spoke about, that was so foundational in starting these conversations. And many of these solutions or frameworks that are developed by this group are absolutely essential. Because to have an ideological goal of climate justice is important and I think essential. But how do we get there? What is the alternative? And I think that's where some movements have run up against a wall, and these tools that are being developed and continually being developed, and they're not just incremental tools that are going to tweak the system that we're living in, right? They're totally fundamentally reimagined from a people's perspective, and I think that is important. So again, I just want to echo Chiamo and say, the kind of work that is being done in these spaces and on the Youth Day, the time is now for the youth to take up these conversations, to take up the space in these decision-making processes. And I think the Climate Justice Charter is offering fantastic tools in order to do that. So thank you very much. And it's been a pleasure spending a bit of the day with all of you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. And I also would like to echo that sentiment that it's been a pleasure and a privilege. And just as I close off this part of the program before I hand over to Stacey, I just want to jump a little bit on what Matthew and Tiamo had said with regards to the politics of climate justice and its importance and its place, the agency that students have and youth, particularly inside and outside universities. I'm to and to see what is possible with regards to addressing the crisis, but it also gave me agency to not feel like I'm being tossed on the shore with regards to how things are happening, and sometimes it just feels like it's all beyond us. But this book is an example of perspectives and agency that people are taking right now where they are to address a crisis as big and as existential as a climate crisis, just where they are right now. And I think, obviously some of the hope, or a large part of the hope, comes from alternatives and the way in which they can be implemented at grassroots, just as Charles was speaking about with regards to some of the tools that we've worked on, and also what Matthew said and Tiamo with regards to what the Charter offers in a clear, explainable definition of not only what we're grappling with, but the ways in which we can deal with it. But fundamentally, a movement and the work of climate justice and the true heart of the Climate Justice Charter and climate justice politics is in its people. And that requires our work beyond just outlining these perspectives and giving hope in this way, is also to build the movement and to help build the Climate Justice Charter where it is and wherever people are and wherever you are. Because the perspectives and the alternatives live online in this book through the contributions of its authors and in the reality of the people who've implemented these things. But for them to become a societal reality and for them to become a real vision of shifting us away from our current trajectory, it requires for us to build a movement. And part of this work and part of this engagement is in service of that, to build the movement. And I think that's just the final call that I'd like to leave everyone on with, is that take the message of hope, take it for yourself, but also take it forward. And that's how you build the movement, by giving it to others who can do the same. So thank you, everyone. And I want to thank Matthew and Tiamo once again, but also another big thanks to the Daily Maverick, who published each of these articles. So if you want to check those out online, you can find them. But the downloadable version of this book will also be shared. The link will be shared as it was shared in the chat when this is also sent out, because this is also being recorded. So thank you, everyone. And I'll hand over to Stacey.
Thanks, Wande. That was a wonderful session. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that Matthew took up my challenge of giving us an example of using one of the tools that Charles presented, so that we can have a practical, as he called it, a case study of one of the tools being used so successfully in the context of the University of Stellenbosch, and also the challenges that he's come up against. I think Are you hearing me all right, Awande?
Yeah, sorry, Stacey, you'd frozen for a second, but you're back.
Okay, great. So I was just thanking Matthew for giving us that case study of using the people's planning tool in his own context in the University of Stellenbosch, and also sharing some of the challenges that they've come against in terms of sort of trying to provoke this fundamental transition in institutions. I think that's one of the ideas that has come through right from the beginning when Raina was presenting some of the challenges that they have come up against in their first few months as the WITS what's it called? Society, there we go. The society at WITS for the CJCM. Where she mentioned issues of trying to change big institutions and how it's something that's come up again in Ferial's talk and even in Charles's talk. I think it's amazing to get together on a day like today, a day that celebrates a struggle that has I wouldn't say it has been won entirely, but certainly great progress has been made in terms of youth in this country. If we think about what was being protested against in that moment, how much has changed. And the last speakers have given us a lot to be grateful for in the sense that there is hope. I liked what Cassandra spoke about in the beginning, that and I think what Awande has been saying now as well. In the end, this is a struggle fought by people who need hope, who need joy to sustain themselves. But again, what Raina mentioned, that even small progress is progress. So thank you for all coming together today. I hope that people are leaving feeling encouraged by seeing some of the small and great progress that is being made in terms of defining ideas, like Ferial mentioned, and when we manage to get more clarity by putting the work into understanding what is happening around the world. Another very useful challenge, I would say, by Ferial was in terms of movements needing to work together and support each other. That's one of the foundational principles of the CJCM, is to try and promote cooperation between different movements and different struggles. We've seen from the presentations by the youth in the beginning of today's session or assembly, how the intersectionality of the climate justice struggle, and Cassandra shared a testimony of how she came to that conclusion herself. And then in Awanda's presentation, we've also seen that in a more technical sense, that these things are all related and that we need to have a holistic way of thinking, but also it's an opportunity for us to bring together a very broad movement, a very broad base, because indeed we have so much in common. And yeah, I think the more clarity we have in terms of our ideas and the more we reach out to form those relationships, it's work, of course, and perhaps we do feel overwhelmed at times and we feel like we are struggling against something that doesn't change. But let us look back as well and realize that things do change, and that they change by the efforts of people, and people who support one another. Yeah. Also, thanks Chiamo for sharing your contribution into the book. I encourage you to get involved in the working group on the Climate Justice Charter systemic alternative. I think it's number 8, which is around building and eco-social housing. And I encourage everybody who's here today or who might watch this recording, that we are working hard to learn from experience in other countries, to do some rigorous research, that this is not just a word shopping exercise. Like, we are really trying to see what is possible, what are the decisions that will lead us towards the future that we're trying to envision here. So we have these 14 systemic alternatives, and we are working to get to practical, specific policy documents that can talk to the kind of change that we are trying to envision in the Climate Justice Charter. And what are the steps that need to be made? Of course, some of them are bigger and deeper in terms of what was being shared now in terms of decision making being more democratic. In Matthew's presentation, some of them require big changes in ideology. All of them, I think, are underpinned by a fundamental change in a way of thinking. Ferial spoke, for example, to the idea of decommodification as opposed to privatization. It's a way of thinking that is human-centered, nature-centered. So yeah, as I say, the more we can deepen our own understanding and how we absorb these ideas into our own selves, I think the better we will be able to communicate them to any other person and help people to understand what we are about. And anyway, I thank you very much all for joining us today. We've done well in catching up on time. But I think we can maybe, if anybody would like to say anything at this point, that we have won ourselves a bit of time before 1:30. In the absence of that, then we can close. Maybe I don't know if the people in the venue would like to say any closing comments, but if there's anyone else who would like to say anything before we close.
Just one comment from us, Stacey. A big thank you to the Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene for helping with the organization of the book as well as the launch of the book. And thank you to everyone who has come to be here with us in person. Thank you so much for coming. To those online, we are going to be having refreshments. So thank you very much, Stacey. Thank you, Stacey. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Charles. Sorry, I didn't realize I was taking the mic again, taking the mic back. But yes, definitely to echo Charles's thanks to our generous funders, the Emancipation Future Studies, and also to all those who made this event possible. I know there have been many unmentioned people getting involved in making this happen. So thank you to everybody and to all who joined. Have a wonderful Youth Day and a good long weekend. And yeah, let's keep putting in those small changes that we can.
Amandla.
Wait.